Greetings and welcome to this, the first of 4 events in the Believers Church Lectureship 2022. Special greetings to those who are streaming with us. We're very happy to have you as well. Thank you for joining us. And it's great to see all of you here present. A students sitting right here in the front row. So Seth and Eric, keep it up. You're moving up in the world. I'm very grateful to see people from our community, senior professionals, and a special thanks to Dalton for extending the welcome to others of that group. Ella Penner is the widow of Dr. Herb Penner, who is the initiator of 2 large gifts to the seminary that have helped us immensely. One allows us to do this event, the Believers Church Lectureship. He also was instrumental in founding the Center for Anabaptist Studies with a gift that Ella shares now in that heritage. And Ella, so thankful to you for being a part of this legacy. Can we give her thanks? As I said, this is the first of 4 events. Today we are identifying this lecture as Liberating Barabbas, and then this evening at 7 o'clock, tomorrow morning at 7:30, there are still a few spots at breakfast, and Hannah would be happy, she's in the back there, would be happy to take your name if you'd like to add that to your day. And then tomorrow morning back here at 10 o'clock for the final of these lectures. We're here to give attention to Dr. Drew Hart, and so let me say just a word about him and then give the time to him. Dr. Hart is theology professor, church anti-racism leader, and social change practitioner. Author, activist, professor in theology in the Bible and religion department at Messiah University. He has 10 years of pastoral experience as well. Drew majored in biblical studies at Messiah College. He attained his MDiv in urban concentration from Biblical Theological Seminary and a PhD in theology and ethics from Luther Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. Dr. Hart's dissertation considered how Christian discipleship, as framed by Black theologies and contemporary Anabaptism, gesture the Western Church towards untangling the forces of white supremacy and the inertia of Western Christendom, which have plagued its witness in society for too long. As 2 traditions that emerged from the underside of violent and oppressive Western society, he found Black theologies and Anabaptism, each repeatedly turning to the particularity of Jesus in the Gospels. So Black theologies and Anabaptism together turning to the particularity of Jesus, ultimately calling for the ethic of liberation in the Black church and ethic of peacemaking in the Anabaptist tradition. Drew is the author of 2 books which are for sale here: Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, the 2016 Book of the Month by the Englewood Review of Books, and Trouble I've Seen, a second volume that's available for purchase. And so we encourage you to pick those up. I think Drew would be willing to sign them if you buy them. So please take advantage of that. Drew is going to open us with a lecture time, and I invite you to be considering questions that you will raise in a Q&A time that follows. So, without further ado, Dr. Drew Hart, thank you so much for coming.
I've been looking forward to coming. Let me see if I can get this. right? But here we are, and I'm really excited to be here. I do have to make one confession. I already transgressed because I changed my topic for the first address. But what was going to be the first topic is squeezed into the later address this evening, and so there will be some around that Liberating Barabbas theme that I had mentioned. If anybody was really looking forward to that, you can still catch some of that then. This first talk is really changing the way the church views racism, which really was at a lot of the heart of my very first book, and I think it actually sets up the further lectures quite well. So I want to begin with a story. When I was still in Philly and a seminarian at that time, and beginning to be known for engaging the church around race and racism and what does faithful Christian discipleship mean in the context of a racialized society, I began to get colleagues, pastors inviting me, whether it be to speak at their church, or sometimes pastors just would want to sit down and get to know me, pick my brain, right? And on one occasion, I had a fellow seminarian who we had a couple classes together, but he wanted to reach out to me. And so he said, Drew, can we get together sometime? And I said, sure. And so he lived in the suburbs of Philly. I was in Philly. And so we kind of met halfway. And it was like a hot summer. I know you guys have been having hot summer. So like, I don't know, a kind of hot summer maybe. But it was a fairly hot summer in the middle of the afternoon. And we met at a McDonald's. And there we were at this McDonald's. And we're just wanted to connect. So we weren't having like meals or anything. We just got sweet teas. You ever got like the sweet tea from McDonald's? I'm a sucker for sweet tea, like real Southern style sweet tea, right? With all the sugar. And it's like the real Southern style when like the straw like just stands straight up because it's just so much sugar in it, right? And when, you start sipping and your dentist is like having flashes, knows something terrible is going on, you're getting cavities as you're drinking and you're like, but it's worth it, that kind of Southern style sweet tea. And so there we were just kind of sharing and drinking sweet teas together and chatting and getting to know a little bit about his story. He's getting to know about my story and our backgrounds. Of course, in these kind of conversations, you begin to realize ways in which you have things in common, but also in ways that, we just saw things differently and had experienced life differently as well. And so it was a pretty wide-ranging conversation that we were having. And then partway through, my friend, who he was a seminarian, he was a pastor of a quickly growing kind of, 20s and 30s something at that time, church out in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and he was white, and he reaches out and he's like, Drew, he grabs one of the cups and puts it in the middle. You see this cup? You see how on one side of the cup, has a logo, and on the other side, it has writing. And he said, you can't see what's on my side of the cup, and I can't see what's on your side of the cup. And so I was like, this is interesting, it's interesting. I didn't know exactly where he wanted to go, but I let him finish. And so he went on to say, I need your eyes to see what's on your side of the cup, and you need my eyes to see what's on my side of the cup. And I thought, that was really sweet what he said. It was like almost like, I don't know if you guys don't really have the Sunday school after specials after on Sunday afternoons or something anymore. The 90s, Family Matters or Full House little moments where, they sit down and have a heart-to-heart. That's what we were kind of having there for a moment. But I said to him, that's really nice, but the world doesn't actually work like that. And then I went on and I said, and kind of arrogant maybe, but I said, I already know what's on your side of the cup. And then I went on and explained what I meant by that, right? I said, look, I grew up in a majority black neighborhood, and yet even still I had majority white teachers. My textbooks, centralized Eurocentric history. In fact, all the way up through my PhD, I had to learn about European literature and art and all these things. I was just steeped in it, right? In fact, I couldn't do what I do today had I not learned how to navigate white-dominant cultural spaces, right? So there's a part of my life that I've always had to navigate those realities to even be able to do what I do. And then I said to him, see, the challenge is that you don't have to reciprocate that. You can go your whole entire life if you want to, and you can never step foot in a black community. You don't have to read black authors, understand black intellectual thought, music, art, literature, any of that, right? And not only can you do that, but you can continue to be successful in this country in a whole variety of ways without being penalized for not having that awareness and understanding and experience. And so what I was trying to get at with my friend here was, it's not that, having these conversations were bad. It's always beautiful to share stories, to swap stories with others is really important. And I think we all need to learn how to sometimes slow down and learn how to listen more than just speak, right? But at the same time, there is sometimes, especially sometimes in the church, this tendency to imagine really simplistic answers to complex problems, right? We see centuries and centuries of racism and white supremacy in our back rear view mirror, and what's our answer? Let's have a potluck, right? Or a pulpit swap, right? That'll solve the problem. And sometimes our answers aren't really understanding the depth of the problem that we're actually facing around us. And so sometimes in the church we have these ideas that, this kind of like cross-cultural exchange moments, right, are gonna solve all our problems. All we need to do is have proximity and share a few stories, and the problems will go away. But it ignores the deep, systemic, structural, institutional problems and challenges that we face that won't be solved merely from swapping stories. That we're going to have to get a little bit deeper, and we're going to have to really grapple with what does our Christian discipleship and the way of Jesus actually invite us into in response to the current challenges that we face in society today. In conversations around race and racism, especially right now, it seems like people are butting heads quite a bit. And I think one of the reasons why is because there are different definitions floating around, and people mean different things when they're using the same words, right? So someone might say, that's racist. And then people start debating, and they're not even talking about the exact same thing. You ever have a conversation where you're talking about two different things, but you're using the same words? And I think that happens quite a bit when it comes to racism as well, that we're not always aware of the fact that we don't always mean the same thing. So I don't want to oversimplify, but I'll simplify just a little bit to say that at least in some sense there's these kind of two camps, right, in terms of how we think about race and racism. And it's helpful to be aware of the different ways that we're using the language. Often I say that there is what I call the English dictionary definition, right? The English dictionary definition, for a long time, I think it's starting to change a little bit, but for a long time, if you looked at like the very first definition in the English dictionary, it'd be very simple kind of thing around, racial prejudice or hatred from one person to another, right? And it's about like hating people from a different skin color or racial group, and that would kind of be the emphasis, that kind of personal prejudice. And that's one way, and often some people will say, well, if it's in the dictionary, isn't that the answer? It's got to be right? I'm like, well, it's a little more complicated than that, because, think about all the different definitions that make it into the dictionary. Like, I always blame my own generation, now, like, things like Google is a verb, right? And selfie and all these other things, right? You have all kinds, and oftentimes these things are a reflection of how we use language, not necessarily always a judgment on whether this is the best way to help us see what's going on in our society. That's a whole different question. How do we use the language, and then what is actually helpful to actually see what's going on around us? But if you were to walk into, let's say, a sociology department and ask them for a definition on race and racism, you usually are not going to get merely just a definition that's about personal prejudice from one person to another based on race, right? They're going to have much broader definitions that are going to look at patterns of how our society is organized by race. What are the policies and institutions and structures? How did it develop over time? How do we get racialized into our own sense of identity so that people actually believe that they are racialized, right? So they're going to ask bigger, much broader questions than just personal prejudice. Now, I guess without getting into all the weeds, it's helpful to say that those are contrasting different ways of talking, and it's helpful for us to make sure we know what we're talking about and what the other person is. And so sometimes we've got to slow down and just say, this is what I mean when I use these words. I'll share just really quickly a definition that me and my friend came up with together. We do some work together collaboratively in our region. And so we came up with race is a socially constructed categorizing of human populations into hierarchies of superiority and inferiority based on perceived and purported essential differences, right? And then racism, I have two definitions. A society and its institutions, myths and values, habits and practices conform to the practice of white supremacy, anti-blackness, and indigenous erasure. Or B, racism is a system, practice, and or idea that upholds power that advantages and disadvantages racialized people groups, right? And so systems, structures, power, hierarchy, right? Those are some of the emphases that I think sometimes get missed in our more simplified definition. So when I'm talking about race and racism, this is what I have as a backdrop. Anybody ever heard of the Clark-Dahl experiments? Clark-Dahl, a couple people, yeah. So in the 1940s, they had these Clark-Dahl experiments, and what they would do is they would take a black child or a white child, one at a time, and they put a white doll and a black doll in front of them and then ask them a series of questions. Which doll is the good doll, right? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? And they'd ask them those kind of questions. And maybe we're not that surprised that in the 1940s, many little white children chose everything white as good and right? And so almost across the board, white was almost always the right answer for them. And so they were predisposed and inclined, right, to see whiteness as good and beautiful and right. The reason why people pay attention to the Clark-Dahl experiment is not because of how the white children actually responded. It was actually because they were intrigued by how the black children responded. That's what actually struck people the most. What happened was that when these black children were asked these same questions, you know, which doll is the pretty doll? And there was a fair number of black children that pointed to the white doll. Which doll is the ugly doll? And there was a fair number of black children that pointed to the black doll. And same thing with smartness and all this stuff. And of course, these dolls, you know, basically looked the same other than the color of their skin, you know. And so they had to think about, like, what was going on here? Why would these black children also be re-articulating some of these same things that are these racist ideas, right? And I think it's helpful for us to remember that, you know, that all of us ultimately are just human beings, right? They were all human beings, little children, raised in a deeply racist society that had these dominant ideas, values, and distorted ways of describing and talking about others, that all of them were susceptible to internalizing. And so what ended up happening is it changed like sometimes there's this perception that the real problem with race, you know, I hear sometimes, you know, the real problem is that reverse racism, right? That's the reverse racism, that's the real problem here in our society today. But what's fascinating is that when you look historically, it seems like the greater problem for those on the underside of white supremacy has not been trying to reverse the thing. It's that they also are internalizing damaging ways of seeing themselves and others, right? And so in the same way that the white children needed to be challenged on this. Sometimes even in racial minority communities, they're also susceptible to these same things. Now, of course, it wasn't to the same degree because many of these black children grew up in contexts where there was at least some effort to try to challenge the overwhelming dominant narratives around black people, right? In black churches and schools and stuff were doing that work. But nonetheless, they were still susceptible to internalizing these ideas as well. Now, of course, we would say, well, what does it have to do with today? I mean, it's the 21st century. That was the 1940s. We're way better than that now. But of course, there's been all kinds of reduplications of these experiments in the 21st century with a lot of the same results, right? Children, in fact, with various shades sometimes to move beyond kind of the black-white binary. And what we still see is that overwhelmingly, many children, American children, are raised to internalize racist ideas and racist myths and perceptions of others. And so we have to be aware of how white supremacy and anti-blackness literally aren't just about like your feelings towards other ones. It actually literally shapes how we see in the world and how we're seen in the world, right? I think we miss that as the optics of race. That we think that we're just being neutral and we're just observing the world neutrally, and we're not always aware of literally the filters that disease how we see God's good creation in others, right? The image of God in others is distorted and diseased because of this legacy in which we've been racialized and has shaped our lens that we live in. I don't know if you guys remember a few years ago, Paula Deen was in the news, right? It was a few years ago. Paula Deen was in the news. It was interesting because, if you remember, Paula Deen, she got caught, and it was a whole range of different things, but she wanted to have like this plantation-style wedding and said all kinds of racist stuff, and it all got out. And what was fascinating to me about that moment was that at that moment, everybody and their mama, right, were kind of wagging their finger at Paula Deen. Like, it was like, bad Paula Deen, right? Didn't matter where you were on the spectrum, politics, anything like that. Everybody was like, bad Paula Deen, shame on you, right? How could you say such terrible racist things, bad Paula Deen, right? And I kind of felt it. I was angry when I first heard it. So I was like, yeah, bad Paula Deen, so racist, so bad of you to say these things. We're all embarrassed of you, right? And then something happened. After a while, I was like, wait a minute, how is it that everybody is shaming Paula Deen right now? Something's just not quite right in this moment if everybody is shaming Paula Deen, wagging their finger, right? So I had to think about it. I had to step back out of myself a little bit, and I was like, Drew, did Paula Deen, invent racism? I was like, no, she didn't invent it. Was she a mad scientist that was in a lab somewhere, was cooking this thing up and then filtered it into our water? Is she solely responsible for racism? I was like, no, that's not how it works, right? So now I was thinking about how do I make sense of what Paula Deen said and did? And for me, it became very clear. I was like, I can't scapegoat Paula Deen in this moment. Because if you want to understand how and where these kind of ideas came from that she was articulating, it's not a study of Paula Deen's life, it's a study of the United States of America's history, right? If you want to understand Paula Deen and where the idea came from, all you have to do is study our history as a nation. And that helps us think that, wait a minute, what Paula Deen was saying, she's merely someone that's been socialized into this collective social sin that's been going on. She's not personally responsible for it. She's a participant in it, but she was socialized and formed in it. And so if we're going to point the finger, it's at the society as a whole, not just the individual who also maybe, her sin was that she was still engaging in old racism, right? The outdated kind that it's not supposed to say that form anyway. She was supposed to update to the new version, right? Use colorblind rhetoric and things like that. She didn't update. She stayed with the old version, and that's where she got in trouble. She got her hand slapped for using those terms that were okay in 1950s America, right? And so I think that for us then, there's something that we've got to grapple with as we think about racism. It's so easy to kind of scapegoat the bad racists. Who are the bad racists, right? Who are the individuals that we all want to point our finger at and say, those are the bad folks, and we're the good ones, and we've got our hands clean. But the fact of the matter is we've all got to do some self-assessments and some openness before God around the ways that we have either been complicit and participated in racial systems, sometimes quietly, passively responded, and neglected to faithfully speak up, and hopefully there's at least times in which we've resisted, right? The things that have opposed God's reign here on earth. And so for us, all of us have to take account the fact that there's a overwhelming complicity that we all have. And it shouldn't be hard for Christians of all people to confess that we are sinful and that we're part of social forces at work in our world that are bigger than ourselves, and that we need God's help to resist and to overcome such evil. I remember when I was in Harrisburg, so I went to Messiah from 2000 to 2004, and then I was immediately hired at Harrisburg Brethren in Christ Church, which is, I think, has some similarities, I think, with the Mennonite Brethren, right? Kind of some vibes there, I think. And so I was at Harrisburg Brethren in Christ Church. It was a multiracial kind of inner city church, and we were located like in the Allison Hill section of Harrisburg, which is known for like being like one of the poorest communities between like Philly and Pittsburgh. Like very deep poverty, overwhelmingly black and brown community there. Lots of historic reasons why. You can look at its history and you can see why there's all the issues that they've been dealing with ever since. And so I lived in Allison Hill as well. And so one day I had a 92 Mercury Sable. It was my first car, right? Everybody loves the first car. It was my little bucket. It wasn't fancy, but it did the job. And I hopped into my 92 Sable. I was driving through Market Street, which is like the heart of the Allison Hill, kind of moving through. And like you're really, as you go like 17th, 16th, 15th, 14th. I mean, it's a small city, so like you're getting like into the heart of Allison Hill at this point, right? And this is a community where you don't really see a lot of white people. There aren't a lot of white people in Allison Hill. Allison Hill actually used to be a majority white neighborhood, and then there was like deep white flight, and then deep poverty that fell in the aftermath of that. And so there's a couple, like, you know, I usually say it's the white people that couldn't get out, right? The poor white people that couldn't get out are there, and then maybe a few folks that are serving, right, in the community. But this day, as I'm driving through on Market, I see a lot of white people out, just a lot of white people. I'm like, why are there so many white people here today? Like, what's going on? So I'm going through, I'm driving. As I'm getting closer, I see, like, they all have bright yellow T-shirts on. So I'm like, these folks want to be seen, and they're doing it, right? No one's going to miss them. And you can see, like, as you're coming up, you see there's, like, this flatbed truck, and there's, like, these groceries that they have, and they're just handing out the groceries to everybody. As people are walking by, they're like, you get groceries. Everybody gets groceries, right? I almost pulled over. If I wasn't late to a meeting, I probably would have stopped, because I think I could have got a free bag of groceries. It was like Oprah, right? Everybody gets a bag. And so as I'm going, and what I'm thinking at first is just, oh, silly Christians, right? That's my assumption, right? Oh, silly Christians, not the most effective way to distribute resources, right? Certainly a community that could probably benefit from this kind of thing, but certainly this is not the best way to just be handing out off of the truck, right? Groceries to people that are walking by. But I'm like, I don't really care. So I'm like, silly, right? But then I get a little closer and I see on the shirt what it said, and it said, Harrisburg Invasion. Harrisburg Invasion. Then I'm not laughing anymore. Don't get me wrong, like, I understand sometimes people have a savior complex, right? Like, they come into imagine themselves with a kind of paternalistic way, and they're going to save other folks. Usually it's not the motto of the event. how dare you come into our community, right, with the assumption that you're going to invade our community? Like, that's the framework for what is happening in an invasion? I mean, this was a few years ago, but I was fuming when I left that. I was so mad. And then after a while, I cooled down. But I thought about it. I was like, so many other things could have happened. There were so many different opportunities as followers of Jesus, right? I did go and find out like who they were. I talked to some folks. I was like, what's going on? What's up with this? And this is something that they do, is what I had heard. This is some church, and they're mostly from the West Shore, which it's a historic racial dividing line where across the river, many black folk were not allowed to live on the West Shore, right? Racial restricted deeds on homes, sundown towns, hostility, all kinds of stuff, right? And so there's a reason why the river is very white on one side, and then Harrisburg is majority black and brown right across the river, right? And so they, from outside of the city, came in and designed this event that they were going to invade our neighborhood. And I thought, so many other things could have happened. They could have, reached out to the amazing leaders that I know personally, working and have been working for decades in this community alongside others. And they could have asked, how can we come alongside the good work that's happening, right? We got money. They might have been like, yo, we've got these grocery bags. And be like, no, we don't need grocery bags. Maybe you want a tutor, or maybe you can do the computer class, or whatever, all kinds of different things that they might have been asked. Who knows, right? But for them to have gone to that, there would have been a need to change their posture, right? Because I think about this, and I'm like, all right, Drew, am I being a little too harsh? Maybe I'm being a little too harsh. I mean, after all, they had good intentions, I'm sure, and they wanted to do good, they wanted to help. So maybe I'm just being a little too hard on these folks. So then I thought about, I was like, it's not 1850. They didn't come in here. They didn't seek to enslave my neighbors, right? It's not 1923 or something. They're not like setting up a new Jim Crow system. So maybe I'm just being a little too hard. But then I thought about it some more, and I was like, yeah, but the problem is that even with good intentions, the racial hierarchy still remained in place. They still saw themselves as having everything to give and nothing to receive from others. And that's literally the way in which they were going about service. In fact, too often, if we're honest, in the church, the very idea of Jesus' servanthood gets inverted. The subversiveness of Jesus' service gets inverted, where folks still come out on the top of the hierarchy rather than emptying themselves. And so, what would it look like for folks to come not as having everything to give, but seeking to receive and to be transformed themselves, not coming as teachers, but as students? What would it look like for the first to be last and the last to be first in actual practice, and how we actually interact with one another across these powerful forces of race that have too often shaped the imagination and life and witness of the church in the United States? And so my hope is that there are other ways, right, in the way of Jesus that we can move forward that actually are faithful to the life and teachings of Jesus, and also in particular ways that address the racial realities that we face. One of the big questions that I think many white Christians in particular, I want them to wrestle with, so if that's you, that if you fit that, I want you to wrestle with this question: how and why did European Americans become white? How and why did European Americans become white? Seems like a strange question at first, right? Because what do you mean, how did I become white? I just am what I am. But of course, if race is a social construct, if we were to take a time machine to like the 14th century and say, let's get all the white people together, nobody would know what in the world you were talking about. The white people? There's no white people, right? this is an idea that developed over time. Why? What work did it do? And why did some people assimilate and adopt that? How and why did Americans become white? Let's think a little bit about this idea of whiteness. So I was at a conference, and it was a justice conference, right? Different Christian leaders who were thinking about justice in a whole variety of different ways, pretty broad. And so what they did was during the conference, they had particular like lunch sessions where they invited people to like these special lunches based on some of the particular work that you'd done. It's kind of like affinity groups, right? And so because I had been known for doing some work around race and faith, I was invited to this conversation around racism. And it was really cool because they were like really, like at that time, folks that, I was just looked up to. I mean, there were civil rights leaders like C.T. Vivian was there, and black preachers like Otis Moss III was there, and Lisa Sharon Hart, just a whole range of folks. And I was just grateful to be in the room with all these great folks. And so I'm one of the younger folks there, so I'm just sitting quietly, just letting my elders just like go and just have a vibrant conversation. I'm just listening like a fly on the wall, And as that's going on, one of the folks asked the question. They said, is it compatible, like, can you be white and Christian? That was their question. Can you be white and Christian? And then they went on and said, if whiteness was developed intentionally, the idea of it was developed for the purpose of colonial conquest and slavery, then it seems like there's something incompatible about whiteness and the way of Jesus, right? And then there was some further conversation around that, people kind of jumping in and kind of dialoguing about that a little bit. But it was like a really short lunch, so before we knew it, it was over, and we're all going our separate ways. And so I go out into the hallway, and there was this white woman who comes up to me, and she was in the room. There were a small number of white people that were in the room. And she comes up to me and she asks, she's like, hey, what did you think about, the conversation? So I said, I thought it was pretty interesting. She said, well, what do you think about the fact that they said that white people can't be Christian? So I said, oh, I think I know where this is going. All right. So I said, well, I don't think they were saying like white people in a general sense can't be Christians, because they weren't talking about skin color, right? That's what I was saying. They weren't talking about skin color. They were talking about ways of being in the world, ways of relating with others in the world. And they're saying that there's certain ways of being and relating with others that's incompatible with the way of Jesus, right? If Jesus invited us to reject lording over others, right? And to identify with the least, last, and lost in the world, then there's something incompatible about the way people have been socialized to relate to others in hierarchical ways, in ways that either justify or even silent to the disproportionate suffering in our world. Something is off and incompatible about the two. And so I kind of explained some of the history of how it is. And as I was talking, she begins to cry, and I feel terrible. I'm like, oh no. And I don't know, there's complicated histories around black men and white women in public and stuff, and I feel awkward at this moment because she's crying. I'm not sure, how do I respond in this moment? And so I think, but I'm like, but we're at a justice conference. Everyone here is invited because they care about justice. So I was like, I'm just going to assume that that's her heart. So I said, I don't know why exactly you're crying, but it seems like something around this idea, as you're hearing me talk about the way that Europeans were socialized into the identity of whiteness, is hitting you really hard. And I said, there's probably something to explore there. There's some work that needs to be done to process and make sense of what's going on and why you're responding the way that you did. And then I said, the conversation that we were just having, in some ways, was a little bit advanced because everyone was assuming that everyone knew certain things that maybe not everyone did, and that you might be more, if there's a book on the subject, you might be more towards the beginning, and we were having an advanced conversation. And so do some homework and keep studying. And she actually was very positive in response to what I said. But I think, that moment always sticks with me because I do think when people hear the term white or whiteness, people think we're talking about skin color. And that's not what it's actually about. We're talking about ways of being in the world, ways of relating to others, and the stories that we tell, right? Like that, those are the bigger things. Everyone is made in the image of God. So it's not a question of whether you're people who are of European descent can be Christian. The question is, can we move in ways that are anti the way of Jesus because of the way that race has socialized us to identify our sense of belonging in the world, right? So to help think through this, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but many of our founding fathers were Anglo-Saxon chauvinists, right? They had some pretty significant views as it related to not just people of color, but a lot of white people aren't properly white for them, right? So I'll share this quote. This is from Benjamin Franklin, right? There's so much more terrible people we could find, but I figured let's start with Benjamin Franklin, who's got some interesting views. I'll read it. He says this, which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so, and in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I wish their numbers were increased, right? This just gives just a little taste of some of the mindset at that time, because a lot of folks who we consider white today weren't properly white back then, right? There was an asterisk by their name. Technically white, just enough that you can come here and get land, but not necessarily that you're gonna, as you are, going to be on the fringes and margins, and some groups even explicitly discriminated against because of not being properly what was Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? And so one's degree in which one operated out of that Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity and way of life, not just an identity, but also a way of being in the world, defined how properly white you actually were or how improperly white you were, right? And so you see this idea, Benjamin Franklin and so many others have, that it's not just only racial hierarchy, but even among who's properly white, there's a lot of folks probably sitting in this room that's got an asterisk by your name based on those old standards, right? There we go. And so it's helpful in the U.S. White supremacy on a global level is a lot more complex, but in the United States, we can certainly say that the skeleton of what it meant to be white in the United States was an Anglo-Saxon Protestant skeleton, right? And out of that then, folks who are, they talk about like first stock and second stock Europeans and stuff like that. People had to navigate, they had to make decisions about how and if and when they were going to assimilate into Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity, or at least closer to that, right? And many people did, quite to significant degrees, right? People anglicized their names and ways of being and cut off ties from their homelands in all kinds of variety of different ways to be accepted into this umbrella, which began a changing, right? Race is not a static thing. It's actually malleable and changed multiple times over our history. And so the umbrella of who was properly white expanded as people were willing to assimilate into this social political project of race. And what's fascinating is there's this way in which it's so powerful that everyone that comes to the U.S. as immigrants are quickly aware of the fact of the benefits that come with being white, right? There's access, there's social advantages that come with being white. And so folks don't just anglicize their names and cut off ties and try to assimilate into something else for nothing. They do that because there's a social either benefit or cost to not doing it or not doing it. And there were actually at that time court cases, right, in the early 20th century in which now you have other immigrant groups who are not considered white, even by today's standards, but who were trying to, based on the standards of the day, trying to claim their whiteness, right? Because the claim was that to be Caucasian was what was made someone white. But of course, Caucasian isn't just European. Oops, the categories were not, they were a little sloppy, right? And so all of a sudden you have Syrians and Indians and different groups going and saying, look, we fit the criteria as whites. And of course, they're like, no. We didn't mean you, right? That's not what we meant. I know we're saying it's a biological, but that's not really what we meant when we said, everyone really knows what we mean when we meant. So the definitions changed over time. In fact, there was one case where a light-skinned Japanese American actually claimed, and then they were like, because he talked about being white, like light, pale skin, and like, well, we don't mean that either, right? And so like it was morphing and changing and developing and becoming more sophisticated over time. But the fact of the matter is that why do you have these immigrant groups coming to the US suing for white status in the courts? You only do that because there are deep social advantages that are clearly marketed through our society that advantage some and harm others, because nobody was suing to be black. Now, of course, I know there are folks that say, well, that's all nice and stuff, but like, I don't even think of myself as white, right? Like, that's not my identity. I'm just, I'm George or I'm Bob or whatever, right? I don't have a racial identity. I just move in the world as myself, right? But I want us to think about the ways in which maybe that in and of itself is a way that white people have been socialized to think about themselves, right? Think about it like you go to the grocery store. Y'all have seen the ethnic aisle, right? Everybody seen the ethnic aisle? I don't know. See, I'm an East Coast boy, so I don't know. You got the ethnic aisle here in California too? Okay, a little bit. They're starting to fade a little bit, but they're still around. So you got the ethnic aisle, and I always think like the phenomenon of the ethnic aisle is a very fascinating thing to kind of pay attention to, right? Because so in this one aisle, supposedly, right, is where all the ethnicity and culture is. It's just trapped in this one aisle and nowhere else. Wait a minute, that don't seem right, right? Wait, so you're gonna tell me that like Hot Pockets aren't culturally particular, right? Come on, like one day they're gonna look back like, what people made these, right? So the idea that culture and ethnicity is just in this one aisle and nowhere else, it's just a strange way to categorize the supermarket or anything, right? And one can only do that if one sees oneself as the norm, as the standard, as though their way of doing things is the universal norm upon which everything else is just different all around them, right? I'm normal, I'm plain, and there's difference happening around me, right? Then you can understand the ethnic aisle. And so there's a way in which, and this is actually not, this particular point isn't just about race, but it's about dominant cultures in general, have a trouble seeing their own cultural particularity, right? Dominant cultures tend to have trouble seeing their own particularity. And so it's just like the water, fish in water, right? It's just, you're just so accustomed to it. It's just so a part of your life that you kind of take it for granted. And so when someone says, I'm just plain, or I don't have a culture, and all these things, that in and of itself is a kind of socialization that can't see one's own particularity, one's own distinctness, and what one brings into the world with them, right? And certainly, white supremacy and whiteness as a social construct, a way of being and interacting in the world, relies on that invisibility of one's particularity to actually believe that one is the universal, the standard, the norm in society. And so I had a professor who, he talked about in theology, like, if you look and you pay attention to theology and the way theology was done for a long time, you have, the classic theologians and classic theology, and then you got black theology and womanist theology, feminist and Asian American and Latino and all, everyone else is categorized, and then, then there's just theology, right? Wait a minute. But don't they also have a context and a culture a perspective? Aren't they also situated too, right? And in what ways does whiteness also invite people to see themselves as objective? Like, think about like a referee, right? Like, a referee is someone who, like, they're not participating in the game. They're kind of like outside observers of the game. So they get to tell everybody else who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong, right? You're in bounds, you're out of bounds, right? That's correct, that's incorrect. You can't do it that way, right? We're going to stop. We're going to have to stop, shut that down, right? And so the referee operates as though they are objective and kind of outside the game. But the fact of the matter is, as human beings, though, none of us are outside the game, right? None of us are God. None of us have that universal standpoint of God to kind of oversee and have this objective standpoint. We're all human beings collectively together as finite, who each only see dimly, right? What does it mean for some folks to then continue to claim this posture, that we have the once and for all posture, but we don't need to be in conversation and dialogue, submitting to what the Spirit is saying in community and in conversation to learn and grow from one another. We have the once and for all people in all times. There's a posture in which the sense of objectivity is actually idolatrous, claiming to see and know in the way that only God can know. And so this neutrality it's smoke and mirrors. None of us have that. We're all finite beings, creatures, not the creator, right? And have to grapple with our finiteness in the world as well. I'm going to wrap up just with a story around Bonhoeffer, then we can open up any Q&A. I'm a kind of a Bonhoeffer guy. I like Bonhoeffer quite a bit. And one of the things, I like Bonhoeffer, but not usually for the same reason many others like Bonhoeffer, right? Many people want to, they think about how, what they're going to do if they're going to take down Hitler and all the things. I don't know. Just, kind of really fascinating things that people are they're imagining themselves as like James Bond or something, I'm like, I don't think Bonhoeffer was doing all that, but okay, whatever. But what's more fascinating about Bonhoeffer is the aspects, is the subtleties that often get overlooked, right? Especially among more mainstream spaces. That Bonhoeffer, he grew up in some ways very privileged. He was well-to-do. His family was well-connected. And Bonhoeffer, he got educated at a very, really young age. He had access to like all the education and graduated, high school, college, all stuff. He got his PhD at a really young age. He was traveling the world and in some ways seemed kind of carefree, right? And after he already had his PhD, he decides to go to Union Theological Seminary to do a little extra, a year of theological study. Why not, right? Why not? Enough, get around, let's try the U.S. and see what they've got, right? So he spends a year at Union Theological Seminary, and initially he's not impressed, right? He's like, American, there's no theology here, right? And he's just bashing American theologians, right? And not impressed at all. But then he meets somebody by the name of Frank Fisher. Frank Fisher is one of the few black seminarians at that time, and Frank Fisher happens to be assigned Abyssinian Baptist Church as like his internship, right? He's from like Alabama, but there he is at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. And so because he's assigned there, he invites Dietrich Bonhoeffer to come with him to church. This is 1930, right? 1930. Come to church with me, Bonhoeffer, right? You can imagine Bonhoeffer, all serious, right? Deep thinker and scholar and stuff, going to church, crossing these racial boundary lines in 1930 that you're not supposed to cross, right? This German theologian, very serious. I heard one scholar, he says he imagines that Bonhoeffer went in there thinking like, I'm going to go observe the Negro in his natural habitats, right? Probably all serious, right? Going to take notes and stuff. But then something happens while he's there. He's captivated by what's happening in that space. Something about the preaching and the worship. He can't get it. We literally have letters that he wrote back home about how powerful his experience of the black church was. This Christ that's being preached there. It's invigorating him. Before you know it, he can't get it. He's all in. Bonhoeffer's going week after week. Before you know it, he's teaching Sunday school classes. There's tradition says that he preached at Abyssinian Baptist Church, but they don't need Bonhoeffer. They have Adam Clayton Powell Sr. at this point, which is one of the most famous black preachers, dynamic. They don't need Bonhoeffer in the pulpit. So they're doing him a favor, right, by letting him into the pulpit. He's involved. We know that beyond that, then he starts, getting deeper into Negro intellectual literature at the time. He writes in one of his papers about the debates between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. He believes Du Bois is right. Agitation was the right way to go, right? He's reading the Harlem Renaissance poetry. He's caught up with the Scottsboro trials. He's actually writing back to Europe, trying to get some people to speak into the injustices that are happening. He's paying attention to the lynching. He goes down south. He visits Howard at the time to meet with some Negro intellectuals. Deeply, right? His friend actually, Frank Fisher, actually, as a going away gift, gives him some Negro spirituals. And we know that Bonhoeffer, because his students actually talked about it afterwards, used the spirituals as some of the Christian formation work that he was doing for the underground illegal seminary he was doing in Germany. Deeply shaped by this experience. It shaped who he was. We can see in his writings, there's scholars like Reggie Williams who's done some brilliant work seeing and teasing out things like from Adam Clayton Powell Sr.'s preaching and themes like what everyone gives Bonhoeffer credit for, right? Like costly grace and all that and cheap grace. Themes that he's drawing already from the black church experience that he had, right? And so Bonhoeffer, towards the end of his life, he gets arrested. I think mostly, right, this is not a spoiler, right, for most folks. He gets arrested, and for his some of the illegal activity that he was involved in to undermine the regime. And then he's put into a concentration camp. And then in 1945, just weeks before things are wrapping up, he's executed, he's hung. But right before he's arrested, he writes a letter to his friends and family, because there's some folks that he's involved in that have been doing some work together. And so he writes this letter called After 10 Years, because it's been 10 years of resistance for them. And this is what Bonhoeffer says. He says, it remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of the suffering. If only during this time bitterness and envy have not corroded the heart, that we come to see matters great and small, happiness and misfortune, strength and weakness with new eyes, that our sense for greatness, humanness, justice, and mercy has grown clearer, freer, more incorruptible, that we learn indeed that personal suffering is a more useful key, a more fruitful principle than personal happiness for exploring the meaning of the world in contemplation and action. And what's fascinating about this is that people now taking seriously his experience with Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem and how that disrupted the trajectory that he was on. Like if you read some of his early stuff, he was not your first candidate for, a theologian of resistance, right? In fact, he had some really troubling stuff around, in fact, he was almost like anti-Sermon on the Mount in some of his early writings. And then by the time in 1935, he's got, The Cost of Discipleship, which is centered around Christian discipleship, centered in the Sermon on the Mount. So there's this radical change that goes on. And people think, how was it that Bonhoeffer could, discern right away in 1933 and writes, the church and the Jewish question, talking about resistance and putting a spoke in the wheel if necessary so early on. How could he discern when so many Christian theologians failed to do so? And many would say it's because he actually had this kind of Christian formation experience in Harlem at Abyssinian Baptist Church, where he began to see this Jesus that identified with the oppressed, with the least, last, and lost, and the underside of the world. And he saw the lines connect between that world and then the world that he had to return back to, right as things were going. And of course, Bonhoeffer was not perfect, but I think we see in him ongoing grappling to seek after Jesus from the underside, to get new eyes, right, to see the world literally from below. Because in many ways, the crucified Christ, right, if we take 1 Corinthians 1 seriously, invites us to recognize that God's power and God's wisdom is being revealed, unveiled, literally at the sight of this crucified Messiah. And just so we don't miss the point, right, he goes on, he says, God has chosen the weak to shame the strong, and God has chosen the things that are considered nothing to shame those that are considered something, right? And it invites us into a different kind of Christian discipleship and a different kind of knowing and seeing in the world that's literally from the underside. And that if, as followers of Jesus, if we are going to take seriously the racial crisis of centuries that we've been undergoing, it will have to be a Christian discipleship in the way of Jesus that comes from the underside and sees things from below. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, sound people, you've done a splendid job. Do you have a microphone ready to move around with? Thank you. Let me raise a first question while we're getting ready to raise others. You started by reminding us that Brethren in Christ and Mennonite Brethren have some kind of kinship. Glad that you recognize that like we do. One of the things that we struggle with is also something you began with, and that's the question of individual versus corporate ways of understanding both evil and salvation. So we see it in the Bible. Yeah, sure, there is some corporate salvation, but it makes us uneasy as Mennonite brethren. We're suspicious that somehow personal conversion is going to be lost, perhaps. Have you seen maybe you'll say, well, didn't you listen to the last hour? But have you seen ways in which there's been conversion to be able to see both individual and corporate as a single whole? Is there a string theology theory there that pulls those two things together? I need that because last week I didn't do so well in my lecture, and I've got to have some help next week.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In fact, it's interesting. So in my second book, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but in the actual intro, I actually talk a little. Oh, let me stand here. I don't know if this. I never even turned my thing on, did I? I could have been walking around. I don't know if this will work now, but that'll work. That's a transgressing speaker that was not doing what he was supposed to do. I'll step up. Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? So in my intro, one of the things I talk about is I have begun to use the word deliverance quite a bit. It's just a word. I mean, it's neither here nor there in terms of, but for me, I've been thinking about the word deliverance. And one of the reasons why I've been thinking about the word deliverance, I was thinking about, and I use all the words, and you'll see it in my second book, but sometimes I'll talk about, I use the word liberation, sometimes I'll use salvation, sometimes I'll use the word deliverance. I use different words at times, in some ways, to disrupt us from what we hear in the words, and then what I want people to because in the Bible, it doesn't have the restricted meanings that we bring to it, right? So we've gotten, especially in the Protestant church, we hear the word salvation, and we're thinking oftentimes individual salvation and a spiritual afterworld salvation, right? And that's what we hear when we hear the word. But that's not how the word is used. It's not restricted like that in the actual Bible. You're gonna find a lot of trouble if you actually look in the Bible and you expect to only find that, right? So often in a whole wide range of ways we see salvation playing out, whether it be in little ways, what is it in Psalms 34, right? A man in his troubles cried out to God, right? And he saved him, right? Like this salvation in terms of the troubles of the world that one is facing, or Zacchaeus, right? After, he has his come to Jesus moments, and he does the two things that Americans don't like, right? Which is he says he's going to give half of his wealth to the poor, which is redistribution of wealth, bad, right? And then secondly, he says, then I'm going to give 4 times back what I have exploited from others, reparations, right? And so really bad, right? So he's got redistribution of wealth and reparations going on there. And then Jesus says to him that salvation has come to this house. But of course, there's a whole variety of different ways that we see salvation going up. It's pretty broad, but for any first century Jew, and all Christian theology in some ways is always reflecting back to the big significant moment of salvation in Israel's story, right? It's God's salvation of redeeming Israel out of Egypt's hand, right, and rescuing them, right? That's the most pivotal moment that you keep hearing refer back to over and over again. And then even in Babylon, as they are delivered out of that, is the kind of this second, right, deliverance that happens there. And so I think that for us, our theology ought to be as broad and as malleable as the Bible's theology of salvation, which sometimes, there are times in which there's a spiritual kind of, like Paul at times will have this kind of more spiritual kind of orientation, although even when he does that, he has a much broader, all of creation is groaning, is going to be redeemed theology even within that as well, right? And so I think that that should be, and so when I use the word deliverance, I say that I use that word a lot, and this is more contextual, that I think about the way that I was raised in my own church and how the word deliverance was used, and it had range, right? It could talk about, people use deliverance to talk about spiritual things, physical things, God delivering people from poverty and struggle and health, all kinds of, it just had range in terms of how people use the language. And I really appreciate, even though it sounds a little antiquated maybe as a word and people don't like deliverance, but for me it captures a little more flexibility that we see in the biblical story that I think is helpful. So I use all the words. When I use salvation, I'm trying to stretch it beyond how people think about it. Liberation, I think, is certainly one of the ways that we can use language to describe God's activity of rescuing and delivering folks. But for me, deliverance is really holistic in terms of how it sounds to me. But I understand that it could be a contextual thing that maybe, depending on each person's, what they're going to hear might not hear that.
I think what you said was, when all else fails, study the Bible. And that's good, because a good percentage of the people here are learning how to study the Bible together and doing word studies. So you just got a good one. Did you notice that? Who's next?
I've enjoyed both of your books, along with James Cone and many others. And the question I have from seeing this is, it took Dietrich Bonhoeffer going to the black church to save him from his whiteness. And you see in America the white Protestant church, we're in bad shape. And I mean, Do we all need to be a Dietrich Bonhoeffer and start going to black churches to get our heads on straight? I mean, how? I do work with some disadvantaged people, and it's a blessing beyond belief. But as a white organizational Mennonite German type church, and a Baptist even, how can we experience this other than just leaving our safe little churches and going to downtown churches in Fresno? I mean, sometimes Martin Luther King felt that what he was doing was not only helping the black people, but he was saving the white people from their horrible sin. And I think we need a Dietrich Bonhoeffer experience to save us.
Yeah, so one of the things I talk about at the end of Trouble I've seen is the idea that everyone needs unsettling experiences, right? Everyone needs that. It might not necessarily be in the exact same way that Bonhoeffer did, but we're all often just too comfortable in our own selves, in our own worlds, in our own biases, and we all have, they talk about the sociology of knowledge, the taken for granted biases and ideologies and myths and stories that we live out of, right? And that's your starting point. You don't even think about them. That's where you begin, right? And so we need something that's going to disrupt us from that. And I do think, though, that in some way or form, if one is socialized to be white in the world, right? Again, not talking about skin color, talking about ways of being in the world. If someone is socialized to be white in the world, then the task is to take seriously Jesus' teachings, the first are last and the last are first, and put that into some concrete practice. How am I going to? That's why I said earlier, what does it mean for the folks who came into Harrisburg? What would it have meant for them to see themselves not as teachers, but as students? What does it mean to reverse and subvert the hierarchy that we've been socialized into, right? And so there's an opportunity. We can voluntarily. Sometimes we do it. Sometimes we're caught into moments that we aren't expecting it. I don't think Bonhoeffer was expecting that, right? It wasn't like he was going looking to have his world flipped upside down and to see the world from below. It just happened that way. But I do think we need experiences, and I do think that if we take seriously the way that, in Trouble I've Seen, I kind of coin a term, I call it counterintuitive solidarity, right? And it's this idea basically that we need Christian ways of knowing in the world. And if we can track 350 years, right, from 1619 up to the mid-20th century, in which we can say the majority of white Christians were getting it wrong, right? It's not controversial anymore, right? To say from 1619 to the mid-20th century, the majority of white Christians, as it came to race, was getting it wrong, right? Not controversial. But what does it mean then? How does that shape what we do in our present world? Because sometimes people will say, well, yeah, they got it wrong, but we're right? Right? The majority of white Christians, we've got it right, and it's the black Christians now, they're the ones that are getting it wrong. I'm thinking, what are the odds, right, that the same community that could never get it right, seems, on race as a majority, right? There are always individuals that were, but the majority were being socialized in such ways that they could not perceive the horror of what was going on all around them. Now, 400 years in, why would we assume that everything is flipped on its head, right? And the folks that seem to have the disadvantage in understanding now have the advantage, and the folks who have the lived experience and who had an advantage and seem to get it right the whole way through, now all of a sudden don't know their own lived experience, right? It doesn't seem to make sense. And that's why I turn people to 1 Corinthians 1, which is to take seriously, how does this crucified Christ invite us to a different way of knowing in the world? That's the seeing from below. Right? In one way or the other, we need to receive the stories of others, especially those that have been disproportionately suffering, those in the cracks and edges and margins of society, and that's got to shape our ways of knowing in the world. Literally, like Jesus just was clinged to those on the edges, those who are marginalized in society. If we're following Jesus, then that's where we're finding ourselves. If we're not doing that, then maybe we're not following Jesus. Because we should be finding ourselves in proximity to receive those stories as a regular way of being because we're followers of Jesus. And those, as we receive those stories and carry them as though they are sacred, they will shape us and change us. It's not just about race. I even in trouble, I talk about patriarchy and gender in the ways that I had been socialized, right, to not see and know those things. And it wasn't until I began to receive and hear the stories of others and have had to then change and transform myself, right? So all of us, if we're following Jesus, this is just basic Christian discipleship. And if it's not a part of discipleship, then it's been domesticated. Other questions?
I want to use one of your metaphors to ask the question, but you don't have to use it to answer it. You talked about the referee who's supposed to be neutral and they never can quite succeed in it, and I thought I heard you say that theologians sometimes think they are, but they aren't as neutral as they should be. But that still sounds like they should be. And I'm thinking of a soccer game where you got one person who's supposed to be neutral and 22 people who are not supposed to be neutral. In fact, they'd be failing in their mission if they were neutral. They're trying to make their team win. So what are theologians supposed to do? Are they supposed to be neutral? Are they on a team? Is there a game they're supposed to win? You can answer it without the metaphor, but it helps.
Yeah. So I would say, in some ways, to connect about that, like theologians have no special task other than the basic Christian task of Christian discipleship, maybe with an extra emphasis, right, on thinking theologically with the global church, historic church, and the traditions that they're a part of, right? But they have no, theologians are supposed to do the same thing that we all do and have no special, there is something special in terms of we've had the advantage of studying, and what we study can vary, right? But we've had the advantage of being able to study deeply and thoughtfully over a period of time and have the leisure to do so, which most people do not have, right? But other than that, our task is not that much different. And in some ways, we have to, like, I was a troublemaker when I was in my PhD program, right? Because some people are like, oh, the theologians of the church. And I was like, yeah, it's nice. And I'm in no way an anti-intellectual kind of person, whatever. But I was like, but on the other hand, like, if I have a choice between sitting at the feet of Sojourner Truth or like some of these theologians that everybody, raves about, I'm sitting at the feet of Sojourner Truth. Uneducated, but had a deep connection to God and was faithful and courageous in her walk, trying to follow God. And I think that we can devalue how God speaks and moves among others. In fact, that's a very Anabaptist thing, right? Early Anabaptists believed deeply that the Spirit of God could speak through anybody in the life of the church, and it wasn't just those who were highly educated that had access. It doesn't mean that there's not a special responsibility that theologians have in the life of the church to inform them about the teachings of the church and things like that, the history and all that. I think there is, but we're still finite. Like, I guess that's the issue, is all of us theologians, we're still also finite human beings that also only see dimly, which is why theologians disagree on every subject under the sun, right? So if our theological education alone was enough, then we'd all have arrived at the same answers and views and perspectives on all things, which we have not. And so there's a certain amount of epistemological humility, a humility in our ways of knowing that we've got to do our work in, right? And that humility doesn't necessarily mean that we can't have strong convictions. It doesn't mean that we can't be passionate about it, but it's enough humility that remains open in a posture of conversation with others, to learn from others, to believe that we don't have the whole of it all. We have a part of it, a piece, a fragment, right? And that my fragment and your fragment together, maybe we can see even more together collectively. But I would say, going one step further, though, in this conversation is, not all of our fragments are necessarily equal either. And it's precisely this crucified Christ that we glean that invites us to prioritize the fragments from below, so to speak, as a starting point. That we have to take those things very seriously, which I think the Western church for a very long time has failed to do. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully gets at it. Other questions? Yeah.
Unsettling experiences. Speak more about that. Who needs to have it? Should some have it? Some expand more on that.
Yeah. Who needs to have it and dissolve? So some people are already living, some people's lives are unsettling experiences, right? Like, let's just acknowledge that. Some people don't need it. Some people need a little more settled life, right? Because their life is always being overturned, and they're so vulnerable, and life is so fragile, right? So some people are already there. Some people, that's their existence. And then there's others that are settled, right? And comfortable, and confident and sure about everything, right? And it's that posture of feeling like I know it all already, and I don't need anybody else's perspective, right? Those are the folks that don't realize from the start that they are finite, that they need other people's stories, that they're limited, that their view is incomplete, right? Those are the folks that need to be unsettled. What kind of, again, I don't know, I don't want to be too prescriptive of what exactly, right? Because I do think it can come in so many different ways. God works in our lives and can open us, and what will work for one person won't work for another person sometimes, right? You can have the same experience and one person's crying and their snot's coming out of their mouth, right? And another person's like, just like nothing. You're like, wow, how did that happen? Nothing, right? Or I remember I had an experience, so one of the things I do like to do, which is encourage people to go on some of these like civil rights bus tours. There's my friend Todd Allen runs one on the East Coast. He takes a 9-day trip in the South over the summer, right? And I remember, so I went once, and then that was like 06 or 07 or something, right? Then a couple years later, I took a group of 10 people with me to go on the bus tour as well. And one of them was a friend's dad came with us. I didn't know him at all, right? But he was with us. And I would later find out that he has what we would call some racist views that, we're just not. But I didn't know it at the time. But what I do remember, though, while he was actually on the trip, it was really challenging him. He was like, I remember him saying things like, oh, maybe we had gotten it wrong, and like he was just like verbalizing like just this kind of anguish and kind of wrestling and trying to make sense. So he was beginning to. Now, it's sad, and had I known better, I probably would have followed up with him afterwards, right? Because it's just one thing, and then just go back to normal. You can just kind of reset. But what stories, what experiences carry us and shape how we see and understand the world, right? And sometimes we do need something that's going to disrupt our everyday kind of comfort and stability in life. So yeah, I think it's really important. And I think our discipleship should be providing that for us. Following Jesus should be, if we're not being disrupted from ourselves and our own ways of seeing things as we follow Jesus, then we got to ask ourselves, what Jesus are we following? Which we'll get into on one of the other lectures. Now, all the Jesuses have reflected the Jesus revealed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that have been followed in this land.
Thank you very much, Drew. We'll give you a little break, and then we'll be back together. Let's thank Drew once again. So a reminder that we'll be back here this evening at 7 o'clock for lecture number 2. Tomorrow morning, 7:30, right around the corner, for breakfast, and then 10 o'clock right here again for college hour. Drew was remembering that we waited a whole year for this thing because COVID knocked us out last year, and we're so glad that we've been waiting, and now we've enjoyed this time together. Thank you for joining us. Would you bow with me for prayer as we go? God, we've invited you to give us new light, and we've received that, and for that we're thankful. Thank you for the guidance that you've given us through your servant Drew, and we ask that you'll give him refreshment and that we will return together this evening to again fellowship. Now unto him who is able to keep you from falling, to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy, to the only wise God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forever. Amen. Go in peace.